1820 to 1950, economic growth, more democracy, and poverty reduction. This period saw lots of political change, much of it aimed at spreading the benefits of industrialization more widely across society and limiting economic exploitation by small elites. Democracy, socialism, communism, and opposition to colonization all became important concepts in the political debates. Of course, the French Revolution happened just before this period, yet many key political changes across the world occurred during this 1820 to 1950 period. Let me introduce another dataset history students may like, the VDEM dataset. Of the various datasets I'm using in this video, VDEM is probably the easiest for history students to get into because it deals with a matter virtually all school history textbooks look at in one way or another: the rise and fall of democracy across countries. VDEM goes back to the year 1789, the year of the French Revolution, and is produced by a team of researchers at a university in Sweden who gather information from almost 4,000 experts across virtually all countries of the world. 51 countries have data for this period, 1820 to 1950, but I'm going to focus on just 12 of these countries. The data gives each country a score in each year, depending on things like whether people can criticize the government, how fair elections are, and whether the government itself follows the law. So the data recognize that democracy is not a yes-no thing. Among countries which many would call democratic, some are in reality more democratic than others. Among the 12 countries I've chosen, Britain, France, and the United States displayed relatively high levels of democracy. France experienced sudden ups and downs. This up was the brief Second Republic after a king was deposed and before an emperor took over. During the First and especially the Second World War, democracy suffered in France. Here we see the rights of women to vote in Britain and the USA improving. But the USA's relatively low score here compared to, say, Britain was largely because until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, things such as literacy tests were widely used to prevent many Black and Native American people from voting. But by 1950, a few other big countries had seen improvements in the level of democracy: Japan, Brazil, and China. One thing that assisted the fight for more democracy was better education. For example, the percentage of adults able to read in Britain increased from 53% here to 90% here, mainly because more and more children received some schooling. For the whole world, the figure increased from 12% to about 36%. Having more people reading and writing is also good for us historians wanting to look back in time. There were more reports, newspapers, and statistical tables being produced in this period, meaning from around 1820 it begins becoming much easier to calculate numbers for certain things and to measure change over time numerically. Part of the reason I selected these 12 countries is that it's easy to obtain inequality and poverty data on them. For these years, from a separate dataset by the two economic historians Bourguignon and Morrison. I'm going to call them B and M from here on. Their work has in turn been used by the people at the World Inequality Lab I referred to earlier and by Martin Ravallion in this huge book dealing largely with the history of poverty. Ravallion has referred to the period 1800 to 1950 as the first poverty enlightenment, when the global poverty rate declined from 85% to 55%. Now, how fast is that? The difference is 30 percentage points, and that happened over 150 years. 30 percentage points divided by 150 years is 0.2. So on average, poverty declined by 0.2 percentage points a year. Ravallion also talks about a second poverty enlightenment beginning around 1950, and as we'll see a bit later, beyond that point, poverty declined even faster. But back to my 12 countries. I've used the B&M data to calculate the poverty rates of the 12 countries for 1820 and for 1950. I used the $1 in 1985 standard I spoke about previously. This graph shows the result. at least 70% of the population was extremely poor in all the 12 countries in 1820. But by 1950, there were large differences across countries. Countries which industrialized faster saw the fastest declines in poverty. But now, is there a graph we can use to show nicely for the 12 countries both the democracy and the poverty trend at the same time? I want to get an idea of how democracy may have helped to reduce poverty. The graph we need is an XY or scatter graph. Let me begin with Japan. In 1820, about 78% of people were poor, and the democracy score was low at 0.015. The samurai was still powerful, and ordinary people were to a large extent forced to follow them. By 1950, however, Japan's democracy score had improved to 0.365. Japan had a parliament and an elected prime minister, and poverty had declined to 60% of the population. This was just before Japan became one of the world's rich countries. If you consider all countries, what do we see? There is a kind of path that most countries follow, from less democracy, more poverty here, to more democracy, less poverty here. Some countries moved very little, especially China, which during this period hardly moved in this graph at all. And of course, some countries moved a lot. But some countries followed a path that deviated from the general path a bit. We see that in the United States, where even after the abolition of slavery, Americans of African origin did not enjoy equal voting rights, democracy advanced, but not by as much as it could have. We also see that Russia saw less poverty, but almost no movement when it came to democracy. People in this communist country enjoyed about as much freedom and democracy in 1950 compared to Russia under the Tsar in 1820. But poverty dropped a lot, to 49% by 1950. India, which gained independence from Britain shortly before 1950, experienced almost the opposite of Russia. In the case of India, independence came with considerable democracy. But poverty remained at around 80% for the entire 1820 to 1950 period, in part because industrialization was limited in India. The colonizing power, Britain, made sure that India remained strongly reliant on industry in Britain. At this point, some of you may be asking, but didn't the borders of India change between 1820 and 1950? When the data talks about India, what place is being referred to? Similar questions could be asked about other countries. The approach of B&M is to take the country as existing in 2000 and to estimate what happened through history in that same geographical territory, even if political borders changed. Let's return to our graph covering just democracy. Earlier on, I mentioned that the World Inequality Database people found that up to 1900, the world became more unequal, but that after 1900, there was gradually a return to more equality. Now, do we see such a pattern if we use the B&M data for our 12 countries? Roughly we do. Here we see the percentage of all income earned by the richest 10% of people. In some very unequal countries, such as Turkey and Brazil, the B&M data basically say this type of inequality did not change in this period. Look at Russia, though. The Russian Revolution changed Russia from a very unequal country to an exceptionally equal one. But as we saw in the previous graph, 49% of the Russian population was still considered poor in 1950. So low inequality, but with considerable poverty. To recap, we've looked at a few indicators from this period: level of democracy, poverty rates, and level of inequality. To finish off, let's bring in one last indicator: carbon dioxide emissions per capita. This we can get from dividing total CO2 emissions by the population. Earlier on, I discussed good data sources for both emissions and population. And let's look at the relationship between emissions per capita and poverty. There were countries with little change in the poverty rate over these 130 years and with very low emissions per person. These countries did see spectacular changes on these measures, but nearly all of that happened after 1950. Egypt, Turkey, Brazil, and Mexico saw some change, but it was limited. Japan saw a bit more change. We've already seen the percentage of the population considered extremely poor drop from 78% to 60%. The average carbon dioxide emissions per person went from almost 0 to 1.2 tons. Russia's reductions in poverty were largely because of rapid industrialization in the early Soviet era, and this meant more emissions. Then there's France and Britain, and finally the United States, which among our 12 countries saw the lowest level of poverty by 1950, but also by far the highest emissions per capita at just under 16 tons per capita in 1950. To help us understand the meaning of 1 ton of carbon dioxide, artists have produced images like this. The 1 ton of CO2 would fit into this blue box. In the case of the United States, on average, each person was emitting around 16 boxes like this by 1950. Now, why did emissions in the United States climb so high, considerably more so than in Britain, which had also reached a low poverty rate by 1950? The answer is in part that the discovery of oil in the United States meant oil was cheap, many could afford big cars, travel distances were long, and there was limited investment in public transport. On to our next and second last historical period in this video, 1950 to 1985, an acceleration in poverty reduction. I mentioned previously that 1800 to 1950 has been referred to as the first poverty enlightenment, a period when poverty declined by 0.2 percentage points a year, largely due to economic progress linked to industrialization, but also thanks to more democracy, which helped to spread wealth and income a bit more equally within societies. Poverty started dropping even faster after 1950 in what has been called the second poverty enlightenment. Here, additional factors not really seen before 1950 include the following: decolonization, particularly in Asia and Africa, which for many, though not all, newly independent countries meant development and some prosperity. The increasing emancipation of women, not just in terms of their right to vote, but also in terms of their freedom to work where they wanted, contributed directly to economic development. And also, very importantly, the Green Revolution, involving the invention and widespread use of modern fertilizers, pesticides, and irrigation systems, meant there was a lot more food available. This Green Revolution made a big difference to the lives of farmers and urban people depending on food from rural areas. The leading scientists in this Green Revolution included the American Norman Borlaug, the Chinese Zhuang Longping, and the Indian M.S. Swaminathan. There's a specific reason why I'm using 1985 as a cutoff for this period. Up to around 1985, scientists remained fairly unsure of how industrial and agricultural change were affecting the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the risk of future climate change. During this period, economic data improved even further. More and more places in the world had national statistical offices and central banks compiling data on what was happening in the economy and on international trade. We'll see why data on international trade is so important for understanding emissions. International trade was increasing rapidly in this period. In 1950, 8% of everything being produced in the world was traded between countries. By 1985, this had increased to 14%, and by 2020, this figure would reach around 25%. Let's focus on these 11 countries. Here we see the average CO2 emissions per person. Here's that 16 tons per person for the USA we saw previously. This is not for 1950 though, but for 1959. I'll explain in a moment why I'm using 1959 here and why I'm calling this territorial. Next, the values for roughly the end of my period. These are actually 1990 values. And here I've sorted the 11 countries by their 1990 values. We see how emissions per person increased as the average person became better off and was able to consume more things such as energy and electricity. And we see the enormous differences between countries when it comes to per person emissions. Now, here's the interesting thing. We say all these values are territorial because they indicate emissions produced in the territory of each country. This is easy to understand. If a factory in Germany produces emissions, those emissions are counted as German emissions. But let's say that Germany puts that factory in Brazil, but then exports all the, say, cars produced by that factory back to Germany. If we use a territorial approach, then the emissions from the factory become Brazilian emissions. But if we want to talk about a fair distribution of emissions, should we completely ignore the fact that those cars produced in Brazil by a German company are used by Germans, not Brazilians? Many would argue no. In fact, many would argue that the most important thing is not where emissions are produced, but who benefits from the final product, or who consumes that product. This is the consumption approach to emissions. See the yellow bars in the graph. Some talk about this as the carbon footprint approach. If we use the consumption approach, we see interesting differences for 1990 compared to the territorial approach. Look at South Africa and South Korea, for instance. If we use a territorial approach, then emissions per capita were 33% higher in South Africa than South Korea in 1990. But if we use the consumption approach, South Korea's value is 38% higher than South Africa's. Why? Well, South Africa has for many years supplied a lot of metals, such as iron and steel, for the world. Processing these metals uses a lot of electricity, which in South Africa has been mostly based on coal. So a lot of South Africa's territorial emissions are actually emissions produced because of mining products which are exported to the rest of the world. To put it very, very simply, products linked to high emissions from countries like South Africa are exported to richer countries like South Korea, where quite high levels of consumption are seen. Now, even if it's fairer to use a consumption approach than a territorial approach, in most international negotiations, the territorial approach is used. This is because it's much, much easier to calculate. Using the consumption approach involves very complex analysis of trade. It can get really complex if you consider that, say, platinum from South Africa could be exported to Japan to produce a car, which is then exported to the USA, meaning the emissions from the South African production of platinum should actually be counted under the USA's emissions. And this is putting it simply because a Japanese car is made up of materials from all over the world. The statistics used for this graph come from the very important work done every year by the Global Carbon Budget Group of scientists. This is why I had to use 1959 and 1990, as these were convenient years in the statistics they publish. Well, to sum up, in this period, we saw more international trade, which is a key part of globalization. And while trade could be considered yet another factor that accelerated poverty reduction, it did make it more difficult to understand the responsibility for emissions and to decide on what a fair sharing across countries of this responsibility might look like.